You're listening to WZMB 91.3, Disturbing the Mainstream. And today, you're listening to Good Vibrations Radio during the Feel Good Mix. We're playing some RPM, some hip-hop, some jazz. And today, it's a pleasure to meet with Jayne Anne Phillips, the author of the new book, Quiet Dell. She's going to tell us a little bit about it today. Do you want to introduce yourself, Jayne?
I'm Jayne Anne Phillips. I was born in Buchanan, West Virginia, and this book, Quiet Dell, is actually named after a tiny hamlet called Quiet Dell. It's the story of a real sensation, one of the first sensationalized crimes of the Depression.
Wow.
Con man who lived under several different aliases, was writing to over 200 women through matrimonial agencies, which were, of course, the Match.com of the time, choosing his victims, sort of middle-aged widows that he thought had means. And he got in touch with a widow in Park Ridge, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. They wrote to each other for some 6 months, and that was his usual ploy, to advance a correspondence very carefully, to the point that the woman and he had decided to marry, to have a very spiritual union. Told them all about his mother and his father. All of this, of course, was lies. And he went away with Asta Eicher, and about a week later returned for her 3 children, who were 9, 12, and 14, and took them off to, they thought, his new home with their mother in West Virginia, where he supposedly had vast properties and much wealth. In fact, the whole family vanished. And Quiet Dell is the story of what happened. A 35-year-old reporter, a career reporter, happily unmarried, who works for the Chicago Tribune, Emily Thornhill, becomes very invested in the case because she's sort of pulled into it by the mayor of Park Ridge, one banker named William Malone. And she's instrumental in putting police onto called himself Harry Powers in Clarksburg, West Virginia, putting police onto him. They sent detectives in a little biplane to Clarksburg, West Virginia, and arrested him, and shortly after found the bodies in Quiet Dell. But the book that's only the sort of the halfway point in the book. The voice of 9-year-old Annabelle Eicher, who's a kind of special child, playwright, draws fairies, loves her children's books, and she has a sort of second sight. And in fact, all the way through the book, the reader will realize that some of the things she mentions and sees do take place later. Harry Powers' trial took place in the local opera house before 1,200 spectators, on stage under a glittering backdrop of forest trees left over from a prior production. So the story of the crime is like something out of a dark fairy tale, and Annabelle's voice sort of stays with us all the way through the book. So it's a story about a crime and a story about a serial killer, but it's also the story of heaven and hell. And a story really that's very full of Americana, because it takes place in the 30s, and it ranges from Appalachia to Iowa to Chicago, and it was a whole new world, a whole different world then. Someone could drive 2 states away and be a whole different person. No one knew who anyone was, really.
This sounds like a book I really want to pick up, seriously. As a reader and a writer, I always love to hear about new stories. I saw online that it's similar to In Cold Blood. What would you say are the parallels, the differences, and like what's alike with it?
Well, Stephen King said that people would compare it to In Cold Blood.
Okay.
But what did Stephen King say? Is it on this book?
I think let's see. I think I had that written down in my notes too, because it was a great compliment. He said it's a brilliant fusion of fact and fiction, and she's written the best novel of the year. And it's a story about a serial killer with crimes and capture, and yes, it's also compulsively readable and a story of how a brave woman faces the acts of terrible violence in order to create something good and strong in the aftermath. Quiet Dell will be compared to In Cold Blood, but Phillips offers something who could not be a heroine who, in the light of places, gives us hope for our humanity.
Right. He was saying that Truman Capote couldn't offer that kind of heroine because she didn't exist in that. And in fact, she didn't. Well, she does exist in Quiet Dell, but the big difference is that Capote was really fixed on the killers.
Okay.
They were the ones he wanted to understand. In this book, it fixes much more on the victims, which I think is important.
Yeah, that's a different twist. Most books you read about, like, murder and things like that, it focuses on, like, the killer and what they did.
I think the killers are all pretty much the same.
Yeah, they are. That's very true.
But the victims are different, and I wanted to give these children the chance to live real lives, and I wanted to make them real again. And I think, in the book, you're inside the head of each one of them at a different point. And I also wanted to talk about women, why were these women vulnerable? Was it really just a matter of their own stupid choices, or did it have to do with the societies in which they lived, in which women and children who did not have means were very vulnerable and are still vulnerable to this day? There's this sort of marine legend. If a ship's starting to go down, the word is women and children first.
Wow.
But in real life, women and children are last. I think it's still that way today.
As soon as you said that, I just thought of the Titanic in my head, how they got all the women and children on the boat.
Yeah, but there are a lot of men jumping in there and throwing kids into the water. Yeah. But I mean, this is more about society itself, and especially in the 30s, it was very looked down upon for women to work. Women who were divorced were called grass widows. It was such a scandal to have been divorced.
Okay.
Asta Eicher was a widow, but she was a widow who had immigrated. It's interesting, a lot of the adults in the book came to the U.S. as young adults. Some from Germany, some from Holland, some Asta Eicher came from Denmark. And she was an artist. She was a silversmith and a painter. And her husband had died some 5 years before, and she had just reached the point where, she had nothing left. The Depression had wiped out her business, and she was facing losing her home. And she wrote away to something called the American Friendship Society, which sounds like a religious group, or
it does.
Quakers.
But it was a correspondence club, as they called them, and it was back in the day when the written word was the way people communicated. Every town had 2 or 3 newspapers, and they all published two editions a day, and there were these clubs. Some of them were sort of low class, Cupid's arrows, that type of thing. But the American Friendship Society was supposedly for respectable women, and Harriet Powers perused all of them.
Looking for prey.
Exactly.
Wow.
But I wanted to make it clear why Asta Eicher might have been vulnerable. So you can really get the story of her life and her struggle, and there are also some comic characters in the book. The real names were just so wonderful that they ask for a novel.
So this is based on a true story?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, this is all true. This crime happened in 1931, in the summer of 1931. And the real names include names like the name of the sheriff was Sherard Wilfred Grimm. The name of the judge was Judge Southern. During the trial, all the principals stayed at the Gore Hotel. The name of the clerk at the hotel was